In this class, we are going to do a reading of the poem Kubla Khan as an example of a romantic poem. In the previous class, we have already seen how the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 heralded the beginning. It was an official inauguration of a new age in literature, which we call the Romantic Age. So, through this particular work, both these poets, what they have attempted to do is to make aware or rather tell people about a new sensibility as to how poetry should be written, what a poem should be, and what's the role of a poet. So that's the main idea behind the lyrical ballads. We have already seen how, through the example of the solitary reaper, Wordsworth tells us about his idea about poetry. And for him, what is important? Nature. Nature is the cornerstone around which the whole, you could say, the whole edifice or the whole building of poetry is, you could say, built by Wordsworth. For him, nature is the most important thing. So nature has to inspire you. You become one with nature. You get transfixed. You get transformed. You experience that epiphany, and then you recreate that in the form of a poem. And when you read the poem, also you're supposed to experience the same ecstasy, the same transportation, and then you come back into your normal ordinary life, but then you would be a richer person, a better person, because of that particular experience, because of that flight of fantasy. Now coming to St. Coleridge, he is also a romantic poet, but for him, more than nature, what is important is this idea of imagination. So he was obsessed with this idea of imagination, what imagination is, and what is the importance of imagination uh, in a poet. So he says poets are blessed with a particular, or you could say, a special kind of imagination, which he calls a secondary imagination. And then it is because of this secondary imagination that poets are able to write poetry and then take us to a different plane altogether. So Kubla Khan is a part of lyrical ballads. So lyrical ballads is a collection of poems by both these poets. So Kubla Khan also finds a place there. Um, if you look at the preface, that is that introduction to lyrical ballads, we find that Wordsworth he did talk about the solitary reaper and other poems in that preface. But when it comes to Kubla Khan, there is no mention of Kubla Khan in the preface. So it is kind of ambiguous as well as hazy. We don't really understand the exact meaning of the poet and what the poem and what the poet is trying to tell us through that particular poem. So, what we need to understand is this obsession about imagination that we find in Coleridge gets reflected in the poem also. So, imagination is at the center of Coleridge's theory of poetry. So, we can find his treatise, that is his theory, his writing on imagination in this separate book, separate publication called Biographia Literaria. So, his idea about imagination can be found in Biographia Literaria. He talks about perception, issue of perception. What is perception? Perception is how we see a particular thing, and he is deeply inspired by German philosophers. German philosophers, they spoke quite a lot about perception, seeing, the transcendental, the imaginary, the imagination. Those kind of ideas were a big thing with the German philosophers. So Coleridge was also highly influenced by their thoughts and philosophy. So he talks about imagination as of having two parts. So he says imagination can be divided into two: primary imagination and secondary imagination. So, how would you define primary imagination? Primary imagination is that living power and prime agent of all human perception. That is, every human being sees and perceives things because of the primary imagination. That is, each one of us is born with this. And it is because of this imagination we are able to see and understand the world. So these impressions that we see, it gets registered on the mind and it gets modified by the perceiver, and then this happens in the mind. So what is he saying? When this happens, there is some kind of a creativity happening in our mind. So because of this creativity, we also become like the eternal creator. So we are all mini gods. We are all like God in this act of creation of creation wherein perception is used. That is, when you look at something, what are you doing? You're looking at it and then you're using your imagination to understand what that particular thing is. So this imagination is helping you to create something. So this kind of a creation is like that of the eternal creator, that is God is the original, the real creator who has created everything there. So the first hand creator, and we are all like mini gods in our own small ways. What do? We also experience all these things. We see these things, we perceive them, and then we use our imagination and creativity to give meaning, to give sense to that particular perception. So in that way we all are like the eternal creator. So primary imagination is something that is there in each one of us. We all are born with that. Now, again, primary imagination is universal. Entire humanity possesses this particular kind of imagination. Now, coming to secondary imagination, it's only the poet who is gifted with secondary imagination. So poets are a different set of beings. They are very different from the ordinary people. Why? Because they are blessed with something called secondary imagination. So what is the secondary imagination? It is a superior power that helps poets to accomplish the alchemy of poetic creation. Alchemy, as in, it's kind of a scientific experiment wherein you are using all kinds of mixing and matching, permutation and combination. Different elements are put together, and look at the quotation from him: it dissolves, it diffuses and dissipates in order to create. So all kinds of things are put into the mind, and then there is some kind of a violent activity that happens, dissolving, diffusing, just like what we do in the chemistry laboratory. Different kinds of chemicals are brought together, they are put together, mixed in different proportions and different permutations and combinations, and you have different things originating out of those experiments. So your secondary imagination is something like that, and only the poets have it. The ordinary common person in the street does not have secondary imagination. So when this dissolving, diffusing and dissipating happens, that is that whole creative process, when that happens, what happens? The end product would have an organic unity, which its constituent parts do not have in the world of objective reality. So according to him, the end product that you get out of all this diffusing and dissolving and dissipating, you get an end product. That end product is very, very unique. It is wonderful and it has some kind of an organic unity. But if you were to look into this finished product and you look at each of the component of the finished product, there's a huge difference. So the finished product has an organic unity which the constituent parts do not have. It's like you have hydrogen and oxygen, they're the constituent parts, and when they fuse together, it forms into something much more organic and beautiful, that is water. Now water has a very different identity, a very different unity, which cannot be seen in the individual hydrogen or oxygen. That's what he's meaning when he says that that end product has an organic unity which is not there in the individual parts. So individual parts are not as beautiful or whatever as the end product, but when these things are put together in a particular fashion, in a particular manner, what you get would be something very, very organic and very beautiful, which the individual parts don't have. They don't have that beauty or that organic wholeness. That wholesomeness is missing in their original parts. So this unique form of imagination is called plastic imagination. So this form of imagination, the secondary imagination, under that you have a category called plastic. In your text it's called blastic, it is not blastic. Plastic. Plastic is, the meaning of plastic is that which can be molded and shaped. right? So plastic imagination is the imagination of the poet that helps them to dissolve, diffuse, and dissipate in order to create something wholesome with organic unity, which you will not find in the constituent parts or components. Now, what is Kubla Khan? Now we're going to try and understand what the whole thing is about, right? So when you need to look at the structure of the poem and the a pattern. Is there any kind of a pattern? If you remember the solitary reaper, you can see wherein you have a steady motion, uh, something very ordinary. From there you have a flight of fantasy, you reach a peak and then you come down. So you have that kind of a like a takeoff and flying up in the air and then coming down, that kind of a movement. Now in Kubla Khan, what is there? Kubla Khan is an attempt to create a miracle of art using words. So he's speaking about a pleasure dome. He's speaking about a palace, a beautiful, wonderful palace in the middle of some garden somewhere. So the beauty of this garden, this imaginary garden, is compared to poem. That is the end product. That is the miracle of art using words. And what is a miracle of art using words? It's poem or poetry. So a comparison between a real building, a real palace, a beautiful pleasure dome with that of a poetic piece. So there is a juxtaposition. Juxtaposition as in you're keeping it side by side. So there's a juxtaposition of this um, miracle of art with a work of greater finesse. So kind of a comparison. He's trying to compare the poetry that he is producing with that of this beautiful pleasure dome. And we find that the poet is aware that there is imperfection in his work. That is, his poem is not as chiseled and polished and beautiful as the pleasure dome or the wonderful palace. And then he expresses his renewed hope to make his poetry into a better piece of art. That is, he wants to make it better. He's aware of his own failure. He knows that he's written a good work, but then he's aware that he has not succeeded in creating it just like that of that wonderful building or that wonderful pleasure dome. So there is a realization. So Kubla Khan, this becomes a self-reflexive poem. Now, self-reflexive is it's a poem about writing poetry. So it becomes a meta narrative in itself. Meta narrative, as in about itself. It is thinking and reflecting about its own self. So it's a self reflective meta narrative on the art of writing poetry. That is how poetry should be written. What are the things that should be kept in mind while writing poetry? So now he's trying to create a pleasure dome in verse, and also there is a longing to build the miracle in verses. So he's doing two things at the same time. He's describing this beautiful pleasure dome, this beautiful palace. At the same time, he's trying to write a beautiful poetry. That is, this description of the pleasure dome becomes also, you could say, the miracle in verse. That is, on one hand, he's trying to give us a word picture, a narrative picture of this wonderful pleasure dome, and this narration itself becomes an art of writing poetry. That is how to write, and how he goes about using the correct words and the proper rhyme scheme, the proper imagery. All that is a part of this. So there are two things happening at the same time. So you have comparison, as well as you have kind of a give and take between these two um, images, these two ideas. So now critics, they try to understand this particular poem, Kubla Khan. So instead of explaining it clearly, what they have done is they have built up an aura or a haze around the work. So people, they said that maybe the poem is a reflection of an altered state of reality. We have already spoken about his state of being addicted to opium, right? That opium induced high. So maybe he was having some kind of a hallucination, a kind of a vision. So in the vision, whatever you see would not be very, very clear. It would be hazy. You can see something beautiful, haunting, and then it is kind of very eerie. You may not really get the full revelation as to what the whole thing means. So maybe um, Coleridge was trying to do something of that kind. Maybe he had a reverie, maybe he was in that opium induced state of mind wherein he was hallucinating. So maybe he was trying to recreate that hallucination, that vision of this pleasure dome. So instead of really getting down to the basics and trying to break it down into parts as to what each of these stanza means and what could be the purpose behind this, what have they done? They have given it a mystery. The critics also have done a bad job of trying to analyze this poem. So instead of making it clear, they have built up more mystery and more haze around the work. So when you look at the first part of the poem, what do you see? It's a crude descriptive approximation. So it's a crude description of of a pleasure dome, a palace. So a crude description is given. So the kind of building it is, where it is next to a river called Aleph, and then there is a cave there, and there is again a sea there, and then he's talking about 5 miles of fertile ground. That is, if you have the text in front of you, you can have a look at it. And he's speaking about gardens bright with all kinds of beautiful things. Many incense bearing trees are there, and then forests are there as ancient as the hills, and then sunny spots of greenery. So you find a lot of description about this particular area where the pleasure dome is situated. And when you look at this, you find there are contradictions in these lines, because you find something like a garden, and then you talk about forest. Forest, as in, they are kind of opposites. So, on one hand, you have the description about man made environment, you have garden and the building, everything, because all this is artificial. How much ever beautiful it may be, they're all artificial. So artificial things described on one hand, and at the same time he's talking about something very natural and wildly beautiful, as in the forest and the kind of caves, sea, these kind of things. And he's speaking about the same place. So what do we find is a kind of incongruity, that there is no matching. Things don't really gel, they don't really match. Because on one hand, you have description about an artificial scenery, and on the other hand, he's speaking about the same place wherein he's talking about all these pristine, unexplored kind of a terrain, a beautiful wild expanse of land where this is this particular pleasure dome is located. So you find a lot of incongruencies in the description. So this alchemic power of imagination, which is supposed to bring all these disparate, as in different units together, fuse, gel them together, and create a unified whole, is missing. So, this alchemic power of imagination that he uses as a poet by means of words to paint the word picture of this pleasure dome, that's not strong enough to unify the materials into a unified whole. So, he is actually tripping, he's failing to create what he has in mind. So, he wants to create this image of this beautiful, wonderful pleasure dome, which is achieved to some extent, but not to that extent that he talks about when he talks about exemplastic imagination and the gift that is there in the poet, that is the secondary imagination, and the exemplastic imagination, which is supposed to be transformative power. So that transformation doesn't really happen in this particular poem. you know People have seen this incongruity, as in there is no holistic gelling of these disparate and different elements in the poem. So it has been critiqued. So critics have been able to see that. So there are these incongruities in the description. So this idea of savageness, that is wildness, the primitiveness, the hauntedness, that does not really fit into the landscape of this artificial garden where this pleasure dome is situated. So this whole idea is kind of self-defeating. He's trying to paint a picture of this place, but then somehow they don't all fit in together. and the setting of this pleasure dome is too close to human habitation, and therefore you cannot justify the hallucinatory visions of a wailing demon lover. So he's trying to paint a picture of this lonely, lost, dark castle in which there is some demon that is imprisoned and it is wailing and crying for its lover, that kind of pangs. He's trying to paint all that, but then somehow it's not really happening, that it's not really coming across as effective as he would have liked it to be. So the place looks too civilized, so that it cannot really blend with the conjurations, that imaginations of wildness. So he wants to create this kind of an aura around the pleasure dome, but then it is not happening. And then there is a description to a music that the poet hears, a music, some kind of a music played by an Abyssinian girl. So there is a description of a damsel with a dulcimer. Dulcimer is a musical instrument on which this girl is playing music, and the music is so beautiful and captivating. And the description is very nice about this girl. But then the critics, what are they saying? The music played by the girl within the poem is more captivating and attractive compared to the words of the poet. The poet's word don't really come out as attractive as the girl who is playing the dulcimer within the poem. So the end product, as in the poem Kubla Khan, is about this ideal pleasure dome. He's talking about this pleasure dome somewhere set in the wild, very, very enchanting, with lots of mysteries woven around it. That's his idea. But then what we find in the poem is a cruder version. It's not as refined, it's just a crude version. You have a melody that is very enchanting and sweet, but then it does not really transform into the vision that Coleridge has, the kind of vision that he has got. So he has tried to recreate that vision onto paper using words. But then that 100% transportation, or that 100% translation of this vision into words, into poem, has not happened. So this can be seen as an unrealized version of the garden that the poet wishes to build. So there is this desire, there is this vision, this hallucinatory kind of imagination wherein he sees this beautiful pleasure dome and he wants to describe that, and he's trying to describe that by means of rhyming, by means of writing a poem. But then when you look at the end product, the poem really does not take off. It does not really take you to that land of hallucination and demonic lover and mysteriousness. So how much ever he has tried, somehow that wholeness is simply not there. That unified beauty, that unified wholeness that should be there in the end product that Coleridge himself speaks about, is simply missing in the poet. So it can be really confusing. There are lots of contradictions and incongruities in the poem, and the end result looks far from being perfect. So this cannot be really seen as an example of what he means by imagination, especially plastic imagination. So the imagination that dissolves and dissipates and creates something really new. So it has a lot many gaping holes in it, so that you cannot really say that this is that epitome or that perfection of Coleridge's theory of poetry.